today. I'm Suzanne Schulte. I'm president of the Defense Forum Foundation, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our forum. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge members of our diplomatic community who joined us today. We have with us our dear friends from the Embassy of Algeria, Mohammed Ben Azouz, the Deputy Chief of Mission, Dr. Yazid Bouzid, over here. We also have Asin Al-Nango and Hafida Dajoud. My brothers from the Sahara Republic, Ambassador Buhari Ahmed, Mohammed Yeslem Besset from the Sahara Republic, which is a government recognized as the Western Sahara by over 70 nations. I also want to recognize my friend Michael Beer of Nonviolent International. Michael and I have led protests in front of the Moroccan embassy, and today's speaker was being prevented from going back home. In fact, Ambassador John Bolton joined us on one of them. I also wish to recognize a new friend, Amadi, who founded the Darfur Women Action Group and is an internationally recognized human rights activist. Amadi is over here. We're really honored to have you with us today. It's very fitting for us to have so many friends from Algeria with us because the lecture today is given to recognize the efforts of a Muslim leader who embodies the spirit of the great Algerian Emir Abd al-Qadir. The Emir was a scholar and intellectual, a devout Muslim, a freedom fighter, and a great leader and humanitarian. Not many people know about this great man, but like our speaker today, he maintained respect for human dignity despite the horrors committed against his people by those who invaded his country. For Abd al-Qadir, it was the French. For Aminatou Haidar, it's the Moroccans. Emir Abd al-Qadir led the Algerian Muslims in their resistance from 1830 to 1947. Despite his people being massacred and burned alive by the French, he ordered that no prisoner that his army captured be harmed in any way. And furthermore, in respect for their religion, he ensured they had access to Christian priests while they were prisoners. As the author of Truth Jihad, John W. Kaiser wrote, over 100 years ago, before the signing of the Geneva Convention, the Emir demonstrated the meaning not only of the rights of prisoners, but also of the innate and inalienable dignity of the human being, whatever his or her religion. When the Emir was exiled to Syria, he saved the lives of up to 15,000 Christians when his followers protected them from an anti-Christian uprising. The French, his former enemies, gave him the Legion of Honor, while Pope Leo IX, President Abraham Lincoln, and Queen Victoria all sent gifts of appreciation to him. With all the atrocities being committed in the world today, we need that same spirit of Abd al-Qadir. I've worked in human rights issues for nearly 30 years, and I have never met a more remarkable people than the Sahrawis of Western Sahara, or a more just cause than what they seek, the simple right to self-determination. Having been invaded by their neighbor, they have fought for 40 years for something that was first promised to them by Spain, affirmed by the International Court of Justice, and then promised once again by the United Nations in 1991. The Sahrawis have relied on the rule of law, the justice of their cause, and despite the atrocities and injustices committed against them every day by Moroccan authorities, they have worked through peaceful, nonviolent means to press their cause. And even furthermore, they have pledged that they would be good neighbors to Morocco. So this is a cause. It's not against Morocco. It's very pro-Morocco. It's pro-Maghreb. It's pro-freedom. It's pro-advancement in that region and the end of this unjust and illegal occupation of Western Sahara. Every day, Sahrawi human defenders are in constant and terrible danger in Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara, which is why that area is known as one of the world's worst regions of the world. It is very fitting that today we have with us one of the most known and most admired Sahrawi human rights defenders, Aminatou Haidar, to give us the Abd al-Qadir lecture as her noble actions reflect his same spirit. I'm very honored also to have with us from the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, Kate Kelly, who is going to give the introduction of our distinguished speaker. Kate.
Welcome everyone, and most welcome to side and to advocate for the protection of human rights in Western Sahara. Aminatou is president of the Collective of Sahrawi Human Rights Defenders, CODESA, an organization that reports violations of human rights in Western Sahara. In 2008, Ms. Haidar received the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights Award for her courageous, nonviolent work promoting civil, political, social, and cultural and economic rights of the people of Western Sahara, including the rights to freedom of speech, freedom of association, and to self-determination. Ms. Haidar is called the Sahrawi Gandhi. This is due to many things, but one of them is her commitment, her lasting commitment to nonviolence, her continual commitment to nonviolence, despite the violence that has been perpetrated against her, her family, her friends, and her loved ones. She is steadfast in her advocacy for a nonviolent solution. Since 1975, in defiance of a ruling by the International Court of Justice, Morocco has continuously occupied Western Sahara. Through nonviolent means, Ms. Haidar has denounced the human rights violations against the Sahrawi and advocated for the fulfillment of the right to self-determination. In 1987, for participating in a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration, Ms. Haidar was arrested and spent 4 years in a secret prison. There she was brutally tortured and was never charged with a crime or taken to trial. She was kept blindfolded throughout the duration of her detention and suffered permanent health effects. Due to her continued activism in the defense of fundamental rights of all Sahrawi people, despite these hardships, and repeatedly suffered the consequences of speaking out against Moroccan human rights violations. In June 2005, Ms. Haidar was brutally beaten and injured by the police during a demonstration in El Ayoun, the capital of Western Sahara. She was arrested at the hospital after receiving 12 cranial stitches and treatment for 3 broken ribs. She served 7 months in 2005 in the Black prison in El Ayoun. There she and 37 other political detainees began a 32-day hunger strike to demand improved detention conditions, investigations into allegations of torture, and the release of all political prisoners. In the fall of 2009, on returning from a visit to the United States, much like this one, the Moroccan government forcibly removed her passport and expelled her from Western Sahara to the Canary Islands in violation of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. In response, Ms. Haidar went on a hunger strike that ultimately lasted 32 days, garnered international attention, and until she was allowed to return to her country, Western Sahara. I recently accompanied Aminatou to a visit to the European Parliament in Brussels. And while there, she showed her strength, but also her charity. I saw her take time to be concerned with people who were homeless in the city. I saw her give what very little money she has to a homeless person on the street. Poverty and injustice everywhere are her concern. Aminatou is not only a woman of courage and conviction, she is a woman with inspiring compassion. She is a hero to us all. Welcome, Aminatou.
Pour donner une allocution dans le cadre d'un cadre lecture. C'est une petite joie de pouvoir s'adresser à vous dans la tribune de combat démocratique aux États-Unis d'Amérique, pays que sa révolution était parmi les premières dans le monde à avoir affirmé formellement le droit des peuples de disposer d'eux-mêmes, affirmation qui s'est transformée au XXe siècle en règle du droit international.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, first and foremost, I wish to thank the Defense Forum Foundation for having invited me and given me the honor to be today amongst you in the United States Congress to make a speech in the framework of the Abdelkader lecture. I am very proud to talk to you in this forum of democracy in the United States. The United States being a country whose revolution was amongst the first in the world to formally recognize the right to self-determination for all peoples, and which is still in the 20th century upholding the rule of law.
À cette occasion également, permettez-moi de rendre un grand hommage aux musulmans Émir Abdelkader, que saisis du noble et si comportement humain durant l'ère coloniale qu'a vécu son pays d'Algérie, continue de guider depuis plus d'un siècle et demi des générations de l'État musulman éclairés dans leur combat pacifique pour la promotion des valeurs de la paix et de la liberté dans leur pays. De même, je ne vous cache pas que j'étais très émue quand j'ai appris que the Defense Forum Foundation a qualifié mon combat pour l'autodétermination du peuple sahraoui de combat noble et inspiré des idées éclairées de l'émir Abdelkader.
And I am speaking today in homage to the great Muslim leader Emir Abdelkader, whose noble ideas and human behavior during the colonial era and during the plight that his country Algeria lived through continue to guide for more than 150 years generations of Muslim leaders enlightened in their peaceful fight for the promotion of the values of peace and freedom in their country. And I also have to tell you that I am very touched when I learned that the Defense Forum Foundation qualified my own fight for self-determination of the Sahrawi people as a noble fight inspired by the enlightened ideas of Emir Abdelkader.
Mesdames et messieurs, honorable audience, une occupation illégale marocaine de mon pays, le Sahara occidental, le 31 octobre 1975, le Maroc viole systématiquement tous les aspects des droits de l'homme. C'est ainsi que le régime marocain a semé la terreur contre la population civile sahraoui. Des milliers de civils sahraouis s'étaient trouvés contraints de fuir les territoires occupés des Sahara occidental pour sauver leur vie et de rejoindre leurs proches déjà engagés dans l'armée de libération populaire sahraoui.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the Moroccan illegal occupation of my country, Western Sahara, on October 31st, 1975, Morocco systematically violates all aspects of human rights. Thus, the Moroccan regime has terrorized the civilian Sahrawi population. Thousands of civilians found themselves forced to flee the occupied territories of Western Sahara to save their lives and join the members of their family who were already fighting in the freedom army of the popular freedom army of the Sahrawi people.
Durant leur marche dans le désert, particulièrement nocturne, pour échapper aux patrouilles de l'armée marocaine, plusieurs civils sahraouis ont trouvé la mort. De même, en l'absence totale de l'accès aux soins médicaux, plusieurs femmes qui allaitaient ont vu leur nourrisson malade mourir.
During their forced march through the desert, and they had to march at night to evade the patrols of the Moroccan army, several elderly Sahrawi civilians died. And because there was no medical care, several women who were breastfeeding had their babies fall sick and die as well.
Leurs campements provisoires détectés par l'armée marocaine ont été bombardés par l'aviation marocaine par les bombes interdites, à savoir les bombes de napalm, le phosphore blanc et les bombes à fragmentation.
Their provisional encampments were detected by the Moroccan army, and they were bombed by the Moroccan air forces using band bombs, that is to say napalm bombs, bombs using white phosphorus and fragmentation bombs.
Les dizaines parmi ces civils sahraouis ont succombé à leurs blessures.
Dozens amongst those civilians died due to their wounds.
D'autres continuaient de vivre avec des séquelles corporelles graves et irréparables.
And others continue to live with these wounds that are still severe and that will never fully cure.
Les rescapés parmi eux vivent depuis 38 ans dans des conditions difficiles au camp des réfugiés sahraouis à Tindouf, en territoire algérien.
And those that made it to the end have, for the last 38 years, lived in difficult conditions in the refugee camps for the Sahrawi in Tindouf in Algeria.
C'est ainsi que le peuple sahraoui s'est trouvé déchiré.
So this tore the Sahrawi people in two.
Pour les civils sahraouis n'ayant pas pu fuir les territoires occupés des Sahara occidental, ils continuent toujours de vivre les affres de la répression féroce pratiquée par le régime marocain.
As for the Sahrawi civilians who were not able to flee the occupied territories of Western Sahara, they still continue to live under the strong repression of the Moroccan regime.
Des centaines de civils sahraouis ont été enlevés par les autorités marocaines. Les périodes de leur disparition ont varié de quelques mois à 16 ans. Elles étaient séquestrées dans des lieux de séquestration secrets au Maroc et au Sahara occidental où ils avaient trop souffert et étaient soumis aux méthodes de torture corporelle et psychique les plus féroces.
Hundreds of Sahrawi civilians were kidnapped by the Moroccan authorities, and the times of their incarceration has varied, going from a few months to 16 years. They were sequestered in secret places in Morocco and in Western Sahara, where they suffered corporal torture as well as mental torture.
Des dizaines de civils sahraouis enlevés étaient même décédés sous la torture, alors que le sort de 526 sahraouis enlevés depuis les années 70 demeure toujours inconnu.
Dozens amongst those kidnapped civilians died under torture, and we still don't know the fate of 526 amongst them who have been kidnapped since the 70s.
Le Maroc continue toujours de commettre les violations et atteintes aux droits de l'homme à l'encontre des civils sahraouis, aussi au vu de la mission des Nations Unies pour l'organisation d'un référendum au Sahara occidental, connu comme Aminatou, présente au territoire autonome des Sahara occidental depuis la date de la proclamation des cessez-le-feu Sahara occidental le 6 septembre 1991.
Morocco continues to commit these violations to human rights, this under the oversight of the Mission for the United Nations for the Organization of a Referendum in Western Sahara, which has been present in the non-autonomous territory of Western Sahara since the date of the ceasefire in Western Sahara, that is to say since September 6, 1991.
Ces violations et atteintes aux droits de l'homme ont continué d'être commises même après la création au Maroc du Conseil national des droits de l'homme, CNDH, qui est censé agir pour prémunir la société marocaine et sahraoui contre les violations et les atteintes aux droits de l'homme, surtout qu'elle est présentée par l'État du Maroc et les représentations diplomatiques au Maroc de certaines puissances mondiales comme étant un mécanisme marocain des droits de l'homme répondant aux normes de la Déclaration de Paris régissant la constitution des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme, alors qu'elle est en réalité loin de répondre aux principes de la déclaration en question.
These violations to human rights have continued to be committed even after the creation in Morocco of the National Council for Human Rights, which is supposed to protect both the Moroccan and the Sahrawi society against violations to human rights. This Council for Human Rights was presented by the Moroccan state and the embassies of Morocco as being a Moroccan mechanism to protect human rights corresponding to the standards of the Paris Declaration on the constitution of national institutions for human rights. But in actuality, this institution is not upholding the principles of the Paris Declaration.
D'autre part, les violations et les atteintes aux droits de l'homme ont continué également d'être commises par les autorités marocaines à l'encontre de la population civile sahraoui, malgré les appels au respect des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental formulés dans les rapports annuels des départements d'État et des départements d'Amérique sur la situation des droits de l'homme dans les pays du monde et ceux des organisations internationales des droits de l'homme comme Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, le Centre Robert F. Kennedy pour la justice et les droits de l'homme, la Fédération internationale des droits de l'homme, Frontline Defender et autres. Et malgré l'adoption de résolutions du Conseil de sécurité et des rapports périodiques du secrétaire général de l'Organisation des Nations Unies sur la situation au Sahara occidental, adressée au Conseil de sécurité appelant au respect des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
And these violations to human rights continue to be systematically committed by the Moroccan authorities against the Sahrawi civilian population, despite constant appeals to respecting human rights in Western Sahara that have been presented in the annual reports of the State Department on the situation of human rights in countries of the world, as well as in the reports of various international organizations protecting human rights, such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Center Robert F. Kennedy, the International Federation for Human Rights, Frontline Defender, amongst others. And also, despite the adoption of resolutions in the Security Council and regular reports presented by the Secretary General of the United Nations on the situation in Western Sahara directed to the Security Council and calling for the respect of human rights in Western Sahara.
Mesdames et messieurs, pour épargner les civils sahraouis des affres de la répression des autorités marocaines et garantir à mon peuple de jouir de ses droits légitimes, mon organisation, le collectif de défenseurs sahraouis des droits de l'homme Odessa, n'a cessé de réclamer la création d'un mécanisme de l'ONU chargé de la surveillance et la protection des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
Ladies and gentlemen, to protect the civilian Sahrawi from repression committed by the Moroccan authorities and guarantee that my people can freely live their legitimate rights, my organization, the Collective of Sahrawi Defensors for Human Rights, CODESA, has constantly demanded the creation of a UN mechanism that would be tasked with upholding and protecting human rights in Western Sahara.
Dans le cadre de la réclamation de la création d'un mécanisme des Nations Unies chargé de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental, qui est devenu au fil des ans une revendication des organisations internationales de défense des droits de l'homme, ce sont certaines grandes puissances membres du Conseil de sécurité qui s'opposent toujours à la volonté de la communauté internationale, voulant exiger le respect des droits de l'homme légitimes, des droits légitimes du peuple sahraoui, par la création d'un mécanisme des Nations Unies chargé de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental et garantir au peuple sahraoui de jouir de son droit à l'autodétermination, comme c'était le cas en avril 2013 lorsque ces grandes puissances mondiales avaient malheureusement refusé d'appuyer au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies un projet de résolution présenté par les États-Unis d'Amérique sur l'élargissement du mandat d'Aminatou au volet de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
So as I was saying, we are constantly demanding the creation of a UN mechanism to uphold human rights in Western Sahara, and this has in turn become a demand of international human rights defense organizations. But there are a few powers that are members of the Security Council that still oppose themselves to the will of the international community that demands the respect of the legitimate rights of the Sahrawi people through the creation of a UN mechanism to protect human rights. This was the case in April 2013 when these global powers unfortunately refused to support in the Security Council of the United Nations a draft resolution presented by the United States on expanding the mandate of MINURSO to surveillance of human rights in Western Sahara.
Face à cette opposition de ces grandes puissances mondiales et vu l'impossibilité de faire voter par le Conseil de sécurité une telle résolution, la communauté internationale a pu trouver un consensus autour de la résolution 2099 adoptée le 25 avril 2013 par le Conseil de sécurité appelant à l'amélioration de la situation des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental, à la mise au point et à l'application des mesures indépendantes et crédibles garantissant le plein respect des droits de l'homme en gardant à l'esprit les obligations découlant des droits internationaux et à la promotion et la protection des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
And faced with this opposition from these international powers, the Security Council could not pass such a resolution, and therefore the international community did find a consensus on Resolution 2099, adopted on April 25, 2013 by the Security Council, which appealed to improving the human rights situation in Western Sahara, designing and implementing independent and credible measures guaranteeing the full respect of human rights, keeping in mind the obligations stemming from international law and the promotion and protection of human rights in Western Sahara.
Malgré l'adoption de cette résolution du Conseil de sécurité, le Maroc récidive et continue toujours de violer les droits de l'homme les plus fondamentaux du territoire occupé du Sahara occidental.
Despite the adoption of this resolution by the Security Council, Morocco continues to violate the most fundamental human rights in the occupied territories of Western Sahara.
Ces violations et atteintes des droits de l'homme commises par l'État marocain à l'encontre des civils sahraouis constituent d'une part la preuve concrète de la non-amélioration de la situation des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental, contrairement au terme de la résolution 2099 adoptée par le Conseil de sécurité. Il y a ceux qui stipulent les engagements du Royaume du Maroc, notamment la mise en œuvre des recommandations rendues par le Conseil des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies, formulées en 2008 dans le rapport du groupe de travail sur le rapport périodique universel du Maroc, et contredisent d'autre part les dites avancées dans le volet du respect des droits de l'homme exposé dans le rapport périodique universel 2012 du Royaume du Maroc.
These violations to human rights committed by the Moroccan state against the civilian continue to be the concrete proof of the non-improvement of the situation of human rights in Western Sahara. This contrary to the stipulations of Resolution 2099 adopted by the Security Council and the commitments by the Kingdom of Morocco, amongst others, in the implementation of the recommendations of the UN Council for Human Rights of 2008, presented in the framework of the report on the working group on Morocco, and also in contradiction to what is presented in the 2012 report on the Kingdom of Morocco.
Même après l'adoption de cette résolution du Conseil de sécurité concernant le Sahara occidental, le Maroc a continué de s'abstenir d'honorer ses engagements en matière de respect des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
Even after the adoption of this resolution by the Security Council on Western Sahara, Morocco continues to not uphold its commitments in terms of respecting human rights in Western Sahara.
C'est ainsi que l'usage excessif de la force est toujours pratiqué par l'État du Maroc contre les manifestants sahraouis réclamant pacifiquement leurs droits légitimes. Cet usage excessif de la force a donné lieu, dans certains cas, à des séquelles physiques.
And thus, the Moroccan state continues to use excessive force against those who demonstrate and peacefully claim for their rights. And this use of force has led, in some cases, to severe wounding.
Le CODESA a pu répertorier les atteintes et violations des droits de l'homme commises contre la population sahraoui par le Maroc durant la période allant du 26 avril 2013 au 18 mars 2014. Le bilan est lourd et témoigne l'absence d'une volonté réelle de la part du Maroc de respecter les droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
And CODESA did a survey of the violations of human rights committed against the civilian population by Morocco during the period from April 26, 2013 to March 18, 2014. And our conclusion is that it shows no real will from Morocco to respect human rights in Western Sahara.
Durant cette période, 75 manifestations pacifiques ont été violemment réprimées par les forces sécuritaires et paramilitaires marocaines, ce qui a causé des victimes au niveau des manifestants sahraouis. On a recensé 912 victimes et qui sont réparties comme suit. 458 femmes, 399 hommes, 28 mineurs et 27 handicapés.
So during that period, there were 75 demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations that were violently repressed by the security forces and the paramilitary Moroccan forces, which caused victims among the Sahrawi demonstrators. There were 912 victims as follows: 458 women, 399 men, 28 children, and 27 people with disabilities.
De toute façon, j'ai un rapport ici, après je vais le distribuer.
And I have a report here that I can distribute after my speech.
De même, l'État du Maroc fait toujours recours à l'arrestation arbitraire des civils sahraouis exprimant pacifiquement leur opinion politique en faveur des droits du peuple sahraoui à l'autodétermination et réclamant pacifiquement le droit du peuple sahraoui à la souveraineté sur les ressources naturelles et halieutiques des Sahara occidental.
The Moroccan state is still arbitrarily detaining Sahrawi civilians who peacefully expressed their political opinion favoring self-determination and peacefully demanding the right by the Sahrawi people to sovereignty over their natural resources.
Plusieurs détenus politiques sahraouis ont été jugés sans pourtant parler des cas de ceux qui étaient arrêtés sévèrement, tabassés, maltraités, puis relâchés sans être déférés devant la justice marocaine.
Several of these political detainees were judged, but there are many of them who were arrested, severely beaten, and then set loose without ever appearing in front of a court of justice.
Les procès des détenus politiques sahraouis sont souvent entachés de plusieurs irrégularités et abus portant atteinte aux conditions d'un procès équitable, et ce qui met en cause l'indépendance de la justice marocaine.
When there is a trial, there are often severe irregularities and abuses, so it is not a fair process, a fair trial, and the Moroccan justice system does not seem to be independent.
Dans ce cadre, un civil, je parle toujours de la période du 26 avril au 18 mars, c'est-à-dire après l'adoption de la résolution.
So I'm still talking about the period after the adoption of Resolution 2099 that goes from April 26, 2012 to March 18, 2013.
Un civil sahraoui a été même différé devant le tribunal permanent des forces armées royales, et ce malgré l'engagement donné par les autorités marocaines de ne plus faire comparaître les civils devant la justice militaire.
And during this period, one Sahrawi civilian was tried by the court of the Moroccan Royal Armed Forces, despite the fact that the Moroccan authorities had committed to no longer try civilians in military courts.
Les arrestations politiques que le CODESA a recensées après la résolution 2099 sont au nombre de 80 cas.
There have been 80 political detainees recensed by CODESA since Resolution 2099 was passed.
32 en détention provisoire.
32 in provisional detention.
24 poursuivis en liberté provisoire.
24 were released under provisional conditions.
6 mineurs, dont 4 en détention.
There were 6 minors, 4 of them remained detained,
Et 2 en liberté provisoire.
and 2 provisionally released.
17 prisonniers libérés par les tribunaux marocains après avoir purgé leur peine.
And 7 prisoners that were released after serving their time.
Parmi eux, une femme qui a passé un mois ferme à la prison, qui a passé en grève de la faim.
Amongst them is one woman who spent 1 month in prison on a hunger strike.
Je dois rappeler qu'aujourd'hui se trouvent plus de 70 prisonniers politiques aux différentes prisons marocaines et au Sahara occidental. Parmi eux, 21 prisonniers condamnés en 2013 par un tribunal militaire marocain avec de lourdes peines, allant de 20 ans à la peine à perpétuité.
And I have to remind you that today there are more than 70 political prisoners in the various Moroccan and prisons in Western Sahara. Amongst them, 21 prisoners who were condemned in 2013 by a Moroccan military court to long sentences going from 20 years to life.
Ces détenus politiques sahraouis continuent de vivre dans des conditions carcérales déplorables, et ce malgré l'engagement du Royaume du Maroc sur l'amélioration des conditions carcérales dans les établissements pénitentiaires marocains.
These political prisoners continue to live in horrendous conditions in prison, this despite the commitments by the Kingdom of Morocco on improving the conditions of incarceration.
Mesdames et messieurs, la torture et les traitements dégradants sont toujours pratiqués à l'encontre des civils sahraouis arrêtés arbitrairement par les services de renseignement marocains, ce qui est contraire au principe universel de l'incrimination de la torture et une violation même du code pénal marocain.
Ladies and gentlemen, torture and degrading treatment continues to be committed against the civilians who are arbitrarily arrested by the Moroccan intelligence services, which goes against the universal principles on torture and is a violation of the Moroccan code as well.
Dans plusieurs cas, les mineurs et les femmes sahraouis arrêtés arbitrairement sont assujettis à des traitements dégradants.
In several cases, children and Sahrawi women who were arbitrarily arrested were then subjected to degrading treatment.
La justice marocaine s'abstient toujours à ouvrir des enquêtes sur les cas de torture et des traitements dégradants, objet des plaintes déposées par les victimes sahraouis.
The Moroccan justice has still not investigated any cases of torture and degrading treatment, despite the numerous complaints presented by the Sahrawi victims.
Les responsables sécuritaires marocains impliqués dans ces actes de torture et des traitements dégradants jouissent toujours de l'impunité et sont dans certains cas même promis dans leur carrière professionnelle.
The Moroccan members of security forces that are involved in these acts of torture have still benefit from impunity and in some cases have been promoted.
Le CODESA a recensé pendant la période allant du 26 avril 2013 à 18 mars, on a recensé 80 plaintes déposées par les citoyens sahraouis contre des responsables sécuritaires marocains, alors que la justice ne fasse aucune investigation.
So in this period from April 26 to March 18, there have been more than 80 complaints against the security forces, but no investigation, there has been no follow-up whatsoever.
D'ailleurs, on a déjà 365 plaintes déposées chez la justice marocaine contre seulement un seul responsable qui est toujours Sahara occidental, toujours promu.
And there is one member of the Moroccan security forces who has been the object of 365 complaints to the Moroccan authorities, but he remains in Western Sahara and he still gets promoted.
Personnellement, j'ai déposé maintes fois des plaintes contre les forces de sécurité marocaines et au lieu que la justice marocaine ouvre une enquête, elle m'accuse d'avoir incité les manifestants d'utiliser la violence et ça c'est malheureux puisque même c'est le ministre de l'Intérieur marocain qui m'a accusé directement au Parlement marocain le 6 mai passé.
So I myself have complained several times against members of the Moroccan security forces, but instead of opening up investigations into the matter, the Moroccan government says that I'm at fault because I am inciting the population in violent uprising against the government. The Minister of the Interior of Morocco actually has accused me personally on May 6th last in the Moroccan Parliament.
Dans les territoires occupés des Sahara occidental, toutes les formes de l'exercice de la libre expression et la constitution des associations sont toujours interdites par les autorités marocaines. Les principales associations sahraouies des droits de l'homme, en l'occurrence le CODESA et l'ASBDH, sont toujours démunies de leur droit à l'enregistrement légal.
In the occupied territories of Western Sahara, all forms of freedom of expression and the constitution of associations are still banned by the Moroccan authorities. The main Sahrawi associations to defend human rights, that is to say, CODESA and the ASVDH, still have no right to legal recognition.
Au territoire occupé du Sahara occidental, les droits socio-économiques des civils sahraouis sont bafoués par le Royaume du Maroc.
And in the occupied territories of Western Sahara, the socio-economic rights of the Sahrawi civilians are also not respected by the Kingdom of Morocco.
On assiste par conséquence à une aggravation sans précédent de la précarité des conditions de vie de la majorité des civils sahraouis.
This has led to a worsening of the difficulty of the living conditions of most of the Sahrawi civilians.
Au moment où les ressources minières et halieutiques du Sahara occidental, qui relèvent conformément au droit international à la souveraineté permanente du peuple sahraoui, continuent d'être pillés et exploités illégalement par l'État marocain et ses partenaires occidentaux sans que le peuple sahraoui en tire profit.
This despite the fact that the mining resources of Western Sahara continue to be exploited illegally by the Moroccan state and its Western partners without the Sahrawi people benefiting from this. And this despite the fact that these resources do belong to the Sahrawi people.
Ce qui va en outre hypothéquer certainement les intérêts économiques des générations futures au Sahara occidental.
And this will certainly affect the economic interests of generations to come in Western Sahara.
D'autre part, l'État du Maroc continue de commanditer des campagnes médiatiques incitant à la haine contre les Sahraouis.
On the other hand, the Moroccan state continues to encourage hatred against the Sahrawi in the media.
Ces campagnes orchestrées par les médias marocains, la majorité des organes de presse, des partis politiques, des syndicats et une partie de la société civile marocaine.
These campaigns are organized by the Moroccan media, by most of the press of the political parties, unions, and by certain sectors of Moroccan civil society.
Dans ce climat d'intolérance peuvent avoir lieu des attaques violentes menées par les civils marocains contre les civils sahraouis, ce qui va constituer un risque pour le maintien de la paix civile du territoire occupé du Sahara occidental.
And in this climate of intolerance, there have been attacks committed by Moroccan civilians against Sahrawi civilians, which puts at risk upholding peace in the occupied territories of Western Sahara.
Mesdames et messieurs, honorables audiences, l'aggravation de la précarité des conditions de vie et la situation alarmante des droits de l'homme au territoire occupé du Sahara occidental vont nourrir certes l'émergence chez les civils sahraouis, surtout les jeunes, d'une part d'un sentiment de perte de confiance dans les promesses faites à eux par les autorités marocaines et la communauté internationale quant à l'amélioration de leurs conditions de vie économique et sociale, et l'émergence au sein des civils sahraouis, d'autre part d'un sentiment de désespoir devant être à l'avenir un catalyseur d'une riposte violente de leur part, pouvant déstabiliser la paix dans le nord-ouest du continent africain.
The worsening of the living conditions and the alarming situations of human rights in the occupied territories of Western Sahara has created amongst the Sahrawi civilian and more specifically among the youth the feeling on the one hand of a distrust in the promises made by the Moroccan authorities, as well as in the promises made by the international community as to the improvement of their social and economic living conditions, as well as the emergence among Sahrawi civilians of a feeling of despair that in the future could be a catalyst for a violent response which could lead to a destabilization in the northwest of the African continent.
Voyez-moi, je ne peux pas vous cacher mon sentiment d'amertume quand je pense à mon pays, le Sahara occidental, qui demeure toujours le dernier territoire non autonome du continent africain au moment où tous les peuples africains libres ont célébré l'année dernière le 50e anniversaire de la fondation de l'Organisation de l'Union africaine.
And believe me, it is difficult to hide my bitterness when I think that my country, Western Sahara, is still the last non-autonomous territory in the African continent. This at a time when the free African peoples have celebrated last year the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Organization of African Union.
Le Maroc, avec malheureusement l'appui de certaines puissances mondiales, en particulier la France, affiche toujours son refus de respecter les droits de l'homme au territoire du pays du Sahara occidental et de se conformer à la légalité internationale, donnant le droit au peuple sahraoui de jouir de son droit à l'autodétermination.
Morocco, unfortunately, benefits from the support of certain global powers, including France, and still refuses to respect human rights in the occupied territories of Western Sahara and to align itself with the international rule of law and give the people of Western Sahara the right to self-determination.
Dans ce cadre, mes compatriotes sahraouis ne cachent pas leur déception de voir certaines puissances mondiales continuer de soutenir la position politique marocaine relative au conflit des Sahara occidental, de s'abstenir également à une participation effective en tant que grande puissance mondiale à la mise en œuvre du plan du pays du Sahara occidental et s'oppose toujours à l'adoption par le Conseil de sécurité d'une résolution concernant la création d'un mécanisme des Nations Unies chargé de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
And therefore, the people of Western Sahara are disappointed when they see that certain world powers continue to support the Moroccan political position regarding the conflict in Western Sahara and to not participate as global powers and support the implementation of a peace plan for Western Sahara, as well as supporting the adoption by the Security Council of a resolution that would lead to the creation of a UN mechanism to uphold human rights in Western Sahara.
Dans ce cadre, pour se prémunir contre toute éventuelle réponse violente de la part de mes compatriotes, toute génération confondue, et toute éventuelle situation de désespoir pouvant pousser la jeunesse désespérée de mon pays pour exiger la jouissance des droits des peuples sahraouis, l'autodétermination et à la souveraineté sur les ressources naturelles et halieutiques des Sahara occidental, d'épouser des idées extrémistes pouvant déstabiliser la paix dans la région du Maghreb arabe. J'interpelle en tant que citoyen sahraoui défenseur des droits de l'homme le Congrès américain sur la situation alarmante des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental et je l'appelle solennellement à agir davantage pour permettre à mon peuple de jouir de son droit à l'autodétermination et de la souveraineté de ses ressources naturelles et halieutiques.
And in this framework, and to protect ourselves against an eventual violent retaliation by my fellow countrymen of all generations and any situations of despair pushing the youth of my country to demand that the people of Western Sahara benefit from self-determination and sovereignty over their natural resources through extremist ideas leading to destabilization of peace in the Maghreb region. I am informing, as a citizen of Western Sahara and as a defensor of human rights, I am informing the US Congress on the preoccupying situation of human rights in Western Sahara, and I'm solemnly calling on the Congress to do more to allow my country to benefit from self-determination and sovereignty over its human resources.
Mesdames et messieurs, il est à signaler que les violations et les atteintes aux droits de l'homme commises par l'État du Maroc à l'encontre des civils sahraouis constituent un manquement au respect des normes impératives des droits internationaux généraux.
Ladies and gentlemen, one has to note that these violations to human rights committed by Morocco against the civilians of my country do not respect international law, generally speaking.
Ces violations et atteintes aux droits de l'homme sont une conséquence directe liée au conflit politico-militaire reconnu du Sahara occidental depuis son occupation par le Maroc le 31 octobre 1975.
And these violations of human rights directly stem from the political and military conflict in Western Sahara since its occupation by Morocco on October 31st, 1975.
Je crois absolument que ces violations et atteintes aux droits de l'homme ne peuvent cesser d'être commises qu'après l'instauration de la paix au Sahara occidental en permettant au peuple sahraoui de jouir de son droit à l'autodétermination.
And I believe that these violations to human rights will only end after peace has been established in Western Sahara and the Sahrawi people have been allowed to live under self-determination.
Enfin, vu que la situation des droits de l'homme se détériore davantage au territoire occupé du Sahara occidental, vu que le Maroc continue de ne pas honorer ses engagements quant à l'amélioration de cette situation, vu l'engagement du Congrès pour la promotion des valeurs des droits de l'homme et vu également le rôle d'influence que peut jouer le Congrès américain sur l'orientation de la politique étrangère des États-Unis d'Amérique, elle est d'une nécessité impérieuse pour une contribution efficace des États-Unis d'Amérique à la protection des droits de l'homme au territoire occupé du Sahara occidental.
Given the fact that the situation of human rights is worsening in the occupied territories in Western Sahara, given the fact that Morocco continues to not respect its commitments to improving the situation, given the commitment by the US Congress to promote human rights, and given the influence that the United States can have, that the Congress can have on the foreign policy of the United States,
J'appelle le Congrès américain qu'il se préoccupe davantage d'eux.
I'm demanding or calling upon the US Congress to concern itself more
La situation des droits de l'homme au territoire occupé du Sahara occidental.
with the situation of human rights in the occupied territories of Western Sahara,
L'exploitation et le pillage des ressources halieutiques et minières du Sahara occidental, surtout qu'il existe des firmes industrielles américaines qui continuent de mener des activités de prospection minière et pétrolière, et d'autres qui continuent également jusqu'à nos jours d'importer des centaines de milliers de tonnes de phosphate du Sahara occidental, malgré l'existence des clauses dans l'accord de libre-échange signé entre les États-Unis d'Amérique et le Royaume du Maroc, excluant clairement le Sahara occidental du territoire de mise en œuvre de cet accord.
so I'm asking Congress to concern itself more with the situation of human rights in the occupied territories of Western Sahara and concern itself with the exploitation of the mining resources of Western Sahara, in particular because there are US companies which continue to prospect for mining and oil resources, and which continue to date to import hundreds of thousands of tons of phosphates from Western Sahara. This despite the fact that Western Sahara has clearly been excluded from the free trade agreements between the United States and the Kingdom of Morocco.
Enfin, je sollicite le Congrès américain de bien vouloir agir davantage pour une contribution efficace des États-Unis d'Amérique au sein du Conseil de sécurité aux efforts qui seront déployés certes par la communauté internationale pour garantir le respect des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental et sous par l'adoption du Conseil de sécurité d'une résolution statuant l'attribution des compétences de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental à un mécanisme des Nations Unies.
So I'm also kindly asking the US Congress to more effectively commit the United States to get involved in the framework of the Security Council to the efforts by the international community to guarantee the respect of human rights in Western Sahara through the adoption by the Security Council of a resolution guaranteeing that a UN mechanism will be tasked with monitoring the situation of human rights in Western Sahara.
La mise en œuvre et l'application des conventions internationales relatives au pillage et l'exploitation des ressources naturelles et halieutiques et la création d'un mécanisme des Nations Unies chargé du contrôle des ressources naturelles et halieutiques du Sahara occidental et pour trouver une solution pacifique et pérenne au conflit du Sahara occidental garantissant le droit du peuple sahraoui à l'autodétermination.
And the respect for international conventions on the exploitation of natural resources and the creation of the UN mechanism on the monitoring of natural resources in Western Sahara, and in order to find a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflict in Western Sahara, guaranteeing the right to self-determination of the
Mesdames et messieurs, honorable audience, enfin, je saisis ma présence parmi vous pour remercier le gouvernement des États-Unis d'Amérique pour avoir présenté en avril 2013 au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies un projet de résolution sur l'élargissement du mandat d'Aminatou au volet de la surveillance des droits de l'homme au Sahara occidental.
And ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I would like to take advantage of my presence here to thank the United States government for having presented on April 2013 in the Security Council of the UN a draft resolution on broadening the mandate of MINURSO to surveillance of human rights in Western Sahara.
D'autre part, je salue solennellement tous les efforts déployés par les États-Unis d'Amérique pour faire réussir le processus des négociations entre le Royaume du Maroc et le représentant légitime du peuple sahraoui de Franco-Polisario pour trouver une solution pacifique du conflit des Sahara occidental permettant au peuple sahraoui d'exercer librement son droit à l'autodétermination.
And I thank the United States for all of its efforts to successfully conduct the negotiations between the Kingdom of Morocco and the representative of the Sahrawi people, the Front Polisario, to find a peaceful solution to the conflict in Western Sahara, allowing the Sahrawi people to self-determination.
Je continue également toujours de croire dans la volonté de toutes les nations libres de pouvoir mettre un terme à la souffrance vécue par le peuple sahraoui depuis 38 ans. Merci.
And I continue to believe in the will of all the three countries, the will to put an end to the suffering that the Sahrawi people have been living through for the last 38 years. I thank you.
Merci pour